Welcome to today's explainer, The Haunting of Room 333, A Skeptic's Descent. We are cracking open a genuinely terrifying case file today, mapping out exactly what went down in the most infamous room of London's luxurious Langham Hotel. I am so excited to guide you through this because honestly, it is a total masterclass in suspense and the absolute breakdown of reality. So get comfortable because we're about to take a seriously chilling journey.
Now, I want you to really think about this. What actually happens when a purely logical mind collides head-on with an illogical nightmare? Just imagine for a second that your entire worldview is built on hard, tangible evidence. You rely entirely on technology, cameras, microphones, verifiable facts, just to make sense of the world around you. And then imagine having that reliable, predictable reality just completely shatter, right? That is the core conflict we're exploring today. This isn't just your run-of-the-mill ghost story. It's the total structural collapse of a skeptic's belief system.
Okay, let's dive into this. Meet our protagonist, Annie. She's a 25-year-old investigative journalist, and her entire career is built on exposing fakes. She takes a super evidence-based, highly logical approach to everything. Anyway, she's visiting the Langham Hotel to shoot a documentary debunking its myths, and her main target, Room 333. The local legend says that years ago, a doctor brutally murdered his wife in that exact room on their honeymoon, right before taking his own life. So it's the classic setup, right? The unstoppable force of cold, hard logic meeting the immovable object of a grim, violent legend.
The psychological shift actually begins the very moment Annie arrives at the front desk. When she asks for room 333, the receptionist's face just goes completely pale. She forces this super awkward smile and hands Annie her room access. But notice the key here. It's not one of those modern plastic key cards you usually have to swipe like 3 times and pray to get working. No, it's an antiquated, heavy, physical brass key. In a modern luxury hotel, this weird physical anomaly is the very first subtle signal that she's stepping out of the modern world and into something much older and, well, much darker.
And this brilliantly illustrates how psychological isolation is engineered from the ground up. The rest of the hotel is bustling and lively, but the third floor, it's completely stripped of any modern comfort. The corridors are dead empty, the paintings are all faded, and the only light comes from these dim yellow wall lamps that cast some seriously unnatural shadows. Plus, the wooden floorboards creak with every single step. It's basically a sensory deprivation tactic, perfectly designed to replace luxury with this oppressive, decaying atmosphere.
So, at the far end of the corridor, Annie finally reaches the room. The door itself is made of this dark, polished wood, but the real focal point here is the handle. It's a heavy brass handle, and when Annie grips it, she gets a sudden, awful tactile shock. It is unnaturally cold. We're not just talking about a drafty hallway here, it's an intense, localized freezing sensation. She turns the key, pushes the door open, and is immediately greeted by just pitch-black darkness. Basically, it's a Victorian-era room just waiting there in absolute silence. Annie steps inside, leaves her suitcase out in the hallway for a second, and starts feeling around for the switchboard in the pitch black. But here is where we get our first physical breach of reality. The exact second, and I mean the exact second she flips those lights on, there's a loud crash. Her suitcase, which was sitting perfectly still outside, has inexplicably tumbled over. It's a highly specific jump scare that totally defies physics, and it immediately establishes that the space itself is actively hostile to her being there.
So, how does a highly logical person cope with a completely illogical threat? Well, by asserting control, of course. Annie systematically builds up this false sense of security. Step 1, she sets up the tripod. Step 2, mounts the camera. Step 3, connects the microphone. She even lights a fire in the fireplace just to fight off that freezing November air. She orders a sandwich, sits down on the sofa, and dives into her laptop to research the hotel's history. Everything is rolling perfectly. She feels totally protected by the digital eyes and ears she set up all over the room. She falls into this false sense of safety, and eventually she actually drifts off to sleep.
But as you might guess, that piece doesn't last long at all. The suspense spikes sharply here. Annie is jolted awake by a very distinct knock on her door. Disoriented, she kind of ignores it at first. But then the knock comes again, and this time it's accompanied by a man's voice saying, "Your room service, madam." Now hold on, remember, Annie already received and ate the single sandwich she ordered way earlier. There should absolutely be no one at her door. Totally confused, she gets up and peers through the peephole, and standing right there in the hallway is a butler, holding a tray covered with a large silver lid. Annie opens the door and, ever the logical thinker, informs the butler that there's been a mistake. She didn't order anything else. But the butler insists it is exactly what she ordered. He slowly lifts the heavy silver lid. And guys, the source material delivers a completely horrifying jump scare right here. Resting on that plate is not food. It is Annie's own severed head. Naturally, she lets out a terrifying scream and instinctively squeezes her eyes shut in pure panic. But when she opens them just a second later, the butler is gone. The tray is gone. The entire corridor is completely empty. The illusion was instantaneous and deeply, deeply psychological.
So the crucial point is how Annie reacts, and more importantly, how the room counterreacts. She immediately runs to her technology, her ultimate source of objective truth, right? But get this, the camera's memory card is completely corrupted. The audio recorder captured absolutely zero evidence of a knock or a butler's voice, just the sound of the door opening and her own scream. Her trusty technology has completely failed her. And to make matters worse, the door is now jammed and locked from the inside. This is where we really see the intense psychological terror of losing objective truth. It's a total breakdown of control. Her logic hasn't just been challenged, her entire system of reality has been dismantled.
Then the clock strikes exactly 1 a.m. It's literally the witching hour. And despite the fire still actively blazing away in the fireplace, the temperature in the room just completely plummets. We're talking an unbearable, unnatural cold that sinks right into her bones. The environment itself is being weaponized against her, totally defying the actual heat source sitting right there in the room.
Desperate to just ground herself, Annie retreats to the bathroom to splash some water on her face. She leans over the sink, but when she looks up into the mirror, she locks eyes with an absolute nightmare. Standing directly behind her reflection is a man. His face is rotting. He has these abnormally long nails, and he's dressed in torn Victorian-era clothing. Yep, it's the deceased doctor from the legend. And in the reflection, his hands are reaching out, extending directly toward her throat. Annie spins around in a panic, but the bathroom behind her is entirely empty. The entity literally only exists in the mirror's reflection.
Let's move to the climax and see how this builds, because the terror literally spills out of the mirror and into the room. Annie frantically yanks at the locked door, screaming for help, as all the lights in room 333 begin to violently flicker. And in those flashes of strobe-like darkness, the entity actually manifests physically. The source material describes this ghastly figure with a stark white body and piercing yellow eyes. With every single flicker of the lights, it takes a slow, deliberate step closer. Her physical escape route is blocked, and the threat is closing right in on her. Now, hearing her frantic screams, 2 or 3 hotel staff members finally manage to break into the room. But what they witness is honestly far more disturbing than any ghostly apparition. There is no Victorian doctor in the room. There is no physical ghost. Instead, they find Annie completely alone. She is screaming hysterically, and with her own hands, she is violently smashing her own face and head into the shattered glass of the full-length mirror. There is glass embedded in her skin. It literally takes the combined strength of the staff members to physically restrain her, pull her away from the glass, and sedate her until she loses consciousness. When Annie finally wakes up later in the hotel's medical room, the dark twist of this explainer is fully revealed. Annie recounts her experience to the staff, telling them how this horrific man grabbed the back of her head and repeatedly smashed her face into the mirror. But a staff member reveals the truly chilling truth to her. The spirit didn't just scare her, it possessed her. The entity hijacked her body, forcing her to mimic the exact brutal way the doctor had murdered his wife all those decades ago. Her highly logical mind was completely overwritten by this historic echo of violence. Annie physically survived the ordeal, though. As you can imagine, she carries the intense trauma of that night with her. But the legend of the Langham Hotel remains entirely intact. The entity is seemingly still there, trapped in a loop of its own making. And this brings us right back to where we started, looking at the limits of our own rational minds. If your technology completely failed you, and history decided to repeat itself using your own hands, what would you do? I'll leave you with this final, provocative thought. Knowing what we've mapped out today, would you ever dare to turn that heavy brass key to room 333? Thanks so much for exploring this fascinating case with me today. See you next time.